upcoming HBO miniseries Chernobyl is a dramatic recreation of the 1986 nuclear accident.
Chernobyl is on fire. And every atom of uranium is like a bullet.
But what's the true story of Chernobyl?
The Chernobyl nuclear accident was the worst nuclear accident in history.
Journalist Adam Higginbotham wrote the recently published Midnight in Chernobyl. He explains what happened over 30 years ago in what was then the Soviet Republic of Ukraine.
The scale of the accident, the number of people whose lives were turned over, destroyed, or otherwise ruined by the accident kind of dwarfs that of any other nuclear accident. Reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power station exploded early in the morning of Saturday, April 26th, and just released this enormous cloud of radioactive contamination into the atmosphere. And the reactor caught fire and then continued to burn for another 10 or more days and proved almost impossible to put out. Immediately after the explosion, the scene both inside and immediately around the plant was one of total chaos. The contents of the core, so pieces of nuclear fuel, enormously irradiated blocks of graphite, pieces of fuel rods and fuel assemblies were launched out of the top of the reactor onto the ground around the reactor and onto the roofs of surrounding buildings, where they began to start fires. Inside the plant, the nuclear power operators were the ones who had to start trying to put these fires out. Outside the plant, the 2 local fire brigades came to attend the scene. Members of those brigades climbed to the roofs of the surrounding buildings to put out these fires. But of course, what they were surrounded by were sources of gamma radiation that were emitting deadly fields of radiation the whole time they were standing there. And the operators within the plant who were sent to try and get cooling water into the reactor core, laboured for hours up to their ankles in intensely radioactive water, being doused with radioactive water that was falling from the reactor building above them onto them and dousing them and their bodies and the clothes they were wearing. In some places on the roofs surrounding the ruins of the reactor, there were fields of gamma radiation of up to 8,000 rem, which meant that if you spent 4 minutes there, you would absorb a lethal dose.
Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel, and this is Nightline. It seems virtually certain that what the Soviets have experienced is a nuclear meltdown. How serious and far-reaching would the effects be?
Many of the plant operators and first responders were stricken with radiation sickness.
Radiation sickness is extremely terrible. One of the reasons is because of the way that it comes on. If you receive a large dose of radiation, one of the first things that happens is that you begin vomiting and you develop a high fever and you feel absolutely terrible and exhausted and then may become unconscious. You will begin to suffer, you can begin to suffer from radiation burns, which, unlike thermal burns, which show up immediately and then gradually heal up, go in reverse. The burns only slowly emerge and only get worse. And depending on the nature of the radiation exposure, they can eat into your skin down to the bone. There are many terrible ways in which radiation exposure can kill you.
31 people died in the immediate aftermath of the accident. There are varying estimates about the health effects to the populations who lived near Chernobyl. Yet, despite the explosion and the release of radiation, the Soviet Union attempted to cover up the accident.
The only way that the West found out initially was because radioactive contamination was lofted high enough into the atmosphere that it soon reached Sweden, where radiation alarms eventually went off inside a nuclear plant in Sweden more than 1,000 miles away. And the staff there initially thought there was a leak from within their own reactor. And then began asking questions and eventually went to the Soviet government and said, the wind is blowing from the direction of Ukraine. Do you know anything about this? And the Soviet government initially said, no. And it wasn't until Monday evening, more than 2 days after the explosion, that they eventually confessed that something had happened. But even then, they didn't admit to any radiation leak.
От Совета министров СССР. На Чернобыльской атомной электростанции произошла авария. Поврежден один из атомных реакторов.
Even after the accident had been acknowledged and the fires extinguished, the Soviets still had a serious problem on their hands.
They then were faced with the problem of how to prevent all of this radioactive material continuing to leak out into the atmosphere, both into the water table and into the air, just as volatile gases and vapor. And to do so, they decided that they would just build a huge cover over the top of it out of concrete and steel, which was this structure that became known as the sarcophagus. They decided that the best thing, the only thing they could do to stop the radiation leaking into the atmosphere was to entomb the reactor forever. And this is yet another absolutely gargantuan undertaking that was made more complicated by the fact that they couldn't actually get close enough to the reactor itself to do any of this stuff directly by hand, because it remained too dangerous to get that close to the reactor. So a lot of stuff had to be done by using cranes operated with CCTV cameras on the ends of the hooks.
Not only did the accident destroy a nuclear reactor, it rendered an entire region uninhabitable.
The people who were most immediately affected by the accident were the people who lived in Pripyat, which is the Atomgrad, or atomic city that had been built specifically to house the workers who worked at the nuclear plant and their families and all the people that supported them. And Pripyat was built about 3 kilometers away from the nuclear plant. When the explosion first took place, nobody in the town was notified of what had happened. The fire that burned in the reactor started immediately and continued to release radiation, and nearly 50,000 people lived in this town. Pripyat was evacuated 2 days after the explosion, and essentially on that day became pretty much a ghost town. It is a fascinating place because it remains a time capsule of the Soviet Union. So there were red stars on the lampposts, and the Palace of Culture still has these giant hand-painted portraits of Soviet leaders that they would get out every May Day to parade through the streets with.
Higginbotham says the lessons of Chernobyl were the same ones not learned in 1912 with the Titanic.
Like the sinking of the Titanic, the Chernobyl accident is the result of technological hubris, of overconfidence in technology. Just as the proprietors of the White Star Line insisted to their passengers that the Titanic was unsinkable, the designers of the nuclear reactors that were built at Chernobyl insisted that they were among the safest of their kind in the world. And this engendered a level of overconfidence not only in the people who lived nearby, but in the people that operated the reactors that really laid the path to the explosion. And I think if it is a cautionary tale of any kind, it's a cautionary tale about overconfidence in technology, which is a lesson that only grows more valuable as I think technology becomes more closely integrated into our lives with every passing day.
This is InsideEdition.com.